What's going on, buddy? You specifically, the person watching this video, your buddy. I'm Neon Mushroom, and today we're playing some modern Magic the Gathering. A few ground rules, because this is going to be a repeating thing on this channel. So if you're into live Magic the Gathering gameplay, right spot, welcome, you're home here. Here's how this is going to work. I used to do this on another channel called MTG The Stack. If you're into Commander content, highly recommend you go check them out. I might even be making some cameos in the near future on that channel that I used to work at. Anyway, today we're playing Indomitable Creativity, specifically 5-color creativity. I'm not going to explain anything about how that deck works in this video because there's a whole video explaining how that deck works. It's going to be right here. It's going to be down in the description below. It's going to be at the front of this playlist if you found this video through a playlist. And then this is round 1. So after this, we're going to have rounds 2, 3, 4, and 5 because at the LGS I'm recording at, they do 5-round modern FNMs on Friday, which is very cool. Anyway, our opponent today is Ezra. He's going to be playing Murktide, blue-red Murktide. If you don't know what that deck is, Google Andrea Meneguchi. He'll tell you all about it. That's everything you're going to need to know about today's gameplay video. So without further ado, let's start with round 1. Game 1. Ezra wins the die roll, so he's on the play with a hand of 7 cards. We have to mulligan our first hand, which consists of Spell Pierce, Expressive Iteration, Bloodstained Mire, Dwarven Mine, Indomitable Creativity, Fable of the Mirror Breaker, and Arid Mesa. At a glance, this hand looks fine, but I can't beat turn 1 Ragavan, which is super potent in this matchup, so we go to 6. Our second hand has Wooded Foothills, Indomitable Creativity again, Dwarven Mine, 2 Fable of the Mirror Breaker, and Scalding Tarn. This hand is the same as the first one, but a little bit worse. If we were on the play, we'd probably keep it, but we need to try one more time to find a removal spell for the Ragavan. Our 5-card keep ends up being Arid Mesa, Scalding Tarn, and 2 Fable of the Mirror Breakers, with us shipping a Wooded Foothills and a Bloodstained Mire. This hand is no better than the first and second hands we tried, but if we mulligan to 4, we simply won't have enough resources to play the game. Turn 1. Ezra casts Mishra's Bauble and cracks it, targeting himself. Looks at the top card, plays Spirebluff Canal as his land for turn, plays Ragavan, and passes. He'll draw off Bauble in my upkeep, I'll play Arid Mesa and pass back. Ezra will drop a Scalding Tarn, attack with Ragavan, I take it, dropping to 18, and Ragavan triggers, making a treasure and flips Leyline Binding. End of Ezra's turn, I'll fetch to 17 for Jetmir's Garden, then I'll play Scalding Tarn and try to pass back. End of my turn, Ezra will fetch to 19 for an island and cast Consider. In response to the Consider, I'll fetch to 16 for Xander's Lounge. We'll let Consider resolve, Ezra will leave the card on top and draw it. In Ezra's upkeep, I'll cast Binding, which costs 1 thanks to the 2 Triumphs I have in play, but Ezra casts Counterspell targeting the Binding. He'll play Scalding Tarn, attack with Ragavan, dropping me to 14. Ragavan makes a second treasure token and flips Prismatic Ending. Ezra will pass the turn, so I'll shock and Stopping Ground, dropping to 12, cast Fable, but in response, Ezra fetches to 16 for a Steam Vents and shocks it in, dropping to 14, sacks a treasure, and casts Counterspell targeting the Fable. Ezra's going to attack me with Ragavan again. I'll take 2, dropping to 10. Ragavan makes treasure and flips Scalding Tarn. He casts Expressive Iteration and exiles an island, puts a card in his hand. He plays the island from the Expressive Iteration and plays a 7/7 Murktide Regent and passes the turn. I'll play Arid Mesa, I'll try to cast Fable, but Ezra's going to cast Spell Pierce. I can't pay, so it's countered, and we'll go to Ezra's turn, where he'll attack with both of his creatures. I'll fetch, dropping to 9 for a Dwarven Mine. I want to block, but before I can, Ezra casts Unholy Heat on the Dwarf. I die to lethal. Going into game 2 against Murktide, we have a pretty heavy-handed sideboard plan. We're going to remove 4 copies of Spell Pierce, 1 Mountain, 1 Archon of Cruelty, and 2 Indomitable Creativity. In place of the 4 Spell Pierce, we're getting a full playset of Change the Equation, a much more powerful counterspell in this matchup as it counters almost everything in their deck except for Murktide Regent. In place of the Mountain, we're getting a basic Plains. This is a concession to the fact that they're likely going to bring in Blood Moon against us as it shuts down our deck completely. And in place of the 2 Creativities and 1 Archon, we're getting 3 copies of Veil of Summer. Veil is going to allow us to resolve our Ren and 6s, Tefiris, and Fable of the Mirror Breakers, and by cutting creativity, we do a better job at not playing into our opponent's removal and permission. We'll be on the play for game 2, and this time we're keeping a 7-card hand with Expressive Iteration, Lightning Bolt, Archon of Cruelty, a Prismatic Ending, Steam Vents, Dwarven Mine, and Arid Mesa. Having Archon in hand is a little bit clunky, but we have enough removal to drag the game out, so we might be able to hardcast it. We're mainly keeping because we can beat a turn 1 monkey. I'll start with a Dwarven Mine tapped and pass. Ezra will once again lead on Bauble, crack it targeting himself, shock in a Steam Vents, dropping to 18, and pass. In my upkeep, Ezra will draw off Bauble, I'll play a tapped Steam Vents, and at the end of my turn, Ezra will cast Consider. He'll bin an Otawara and draw. Ezra plays Polluted Delta, fetches down to 17 for an island, and casts Ledger Shredder. Then I'll cast Engineered Explosives on 0, which triggers the Shredder, but in response I will bolt the Ledger Shredder. Shredder goes to the bin, but its trigger resolves and he discards a counterspell. Then Ezra will pass. I'll cast Expressive Iteration, I'll put a Dwarven Mind in my hand, I'll awkwardly exile Change the Equation, and I'll put a Ren and 6 on the bottom. Then I'll play Arid Mesa as my land for turn, and pass. Ezra plays a Fiery Islet, drops Dragon's Rage Channeler, and passes back. I'll play an Arid Mesa, I'll fetch, going down to 19 for a Sacred Foundry, and I'll shock it into play, going to 17. Then I'll cast Prismatic Ending, targeting Dragon's Rage Channeler. This resolves, we go to Ezra's turn where he casts an iteration of his own. He exiles Steam Vents and adds a card to his hand, then I'll shock in the Steam Vents, dropping to 15 and pass the turn. I'll just drop Scalding Tarn as my land for turn, and pass, so Ezra will once again cast Iteration. This time he'll exile a Flooded Strand, he'll play the Strand, and then I'll cast Dragon's Rage Channeler. He'll try to pass, but at the end of turn, I'll bolt the DRC, and then I'll fetch to 16, grabbing a Jetmir's Garden. I'll play Dwarven Mine, this time it triggers, so I'll make a Dwarf, and at the end of my turn, Ezra will fetch to 14 for an island, then he cracks the Fiery Islet to draw a card. For the third turn in a row, Ezra casts Iteration, this time he exiles Consider. He'll cast the exiled Consider, bin an Unholy Heat, and then draw a card. He'll play Scalding Tarn, and pass. I'll drop Wooded Foothills, I'll attack for 1 with my Dwarf, dropping Ezra to 13, and at the end of my turn, Ezra's going to fetch to 12 for a tap Steam Vents. Then he'll untap and play a tap Spirebluff Canal as his land for turn and try to pass. At his end step, I'll fetch, dropping to 15, this time for a Xander's Lounge. Then, I'll go to my turn, head into combat, and attack for 1. This drops Ezra to 11. At the end of my turn, Ezra casts Archmage's Charm to draw 2 cards. Ezra's going to play an island, then cast Ledger Shredder. He'll try to pass, but at the end of his turn, I'll cast Leyline Binding. Ezra's then going to tap 2 blue and cast Counterspell, which triggers his Ledger Shredder. He'll draw a card to the Connive, and then pitch Lightning Bolt to grow the Shredder into a 2/4. I'll play Scalding Tarn, then I'm going to cast Teferi, Time Raveler. Ezra's going to respond with a counterspell, but in response I'll cast Veil of Summer. Ezra's going to miss a Ledger Shredder trigger here, and then I'm going to draw off Veil because Ezra did cast a blue spell, then Teferi resolves. I'll minus the Teferi to bounce Shredder and draw a card. Then I'll attack for 1 with my Dwarf token, dropping Ezra down to 10, and then I will play an extra land because we're cheating out here. It was an accident, I totally forgot about the Tarn, but it luckily does not end up mattering. Just cheat. I'll pass back to Ezra, who plays a Ledger Shredder, then casts Unholy Heat, targeting the Teferi, which triggers the Ledger Shredder. He's going to connive, draw a card, and then bin the Flusterstorm to grow Shredder. Teferi dies, then he's going to cast an 8/8 Murktide Regent. He'll follow it up with Mishra's Bauble, crack it targeting himself, and then try to pass, but at the end of his turn, I'll fetch to 14 for a Stomping Ground tapped. Ezra draws on my upkeep thanks to the Mishra's Bauble trigger, and then I'm going to tap 8 mana and hardcast Archon of Cruelty, which does resolve. The trigger's going to have Ezra sacrifice his Ledger Shredder, he'll discard a land, and drop down to 7 life. I'll draw a card, and go up to 17. Then I'll play Bloodstained Mire as my land for turn and try to pass, but at the end of my turn, Ezra's going to cast Unholy Heat targeting Archon, which does kill it because Ezra is delirious. On Ezra's turn, he'll just attack me for 8, dropping me to 9, and pass the turn. So I'll untap and cast another Archon. This time I'll go to 12, Ezra will drop down to 4, and I'll sack the Murktide and discard a land. I'll draw a card, play Arid Mesa, attack for 1, dropping Ezra to 3, then I'll fetch, tap for 1 red, and cast Lightning Bolt targeting Ezra. This kills him, we win game 2. Going into game 3, we are on the draw, and both me and Ezra are keeping 7-card hands. Mine is Arid Mesa, Bloodstained Mire, Lightning Bolt, Expressive Iteration, Wooded Foothills, Veil of Summer, and Archon of Cruelty. This hand can kill a monkey and make land drops. My only question is, where has Ren and 6 been this whole round? Turn 1, Ezra leads on Spirebluff Canal and casts Dragon's Rage Channeler, then follows it up with an Engineered Explosives on 0. This triggers Dragon's Rage Channeler, so he bins a Mishra's Bauble and passes the turn. I play Bloodstained Mire as my land for turn and pass back. Ezra casts Consider, triggering Dragon's Rage Channeler. He keeps the card on top, draws it, then plays Spirebluff Canal as his land for turn once again, attacks me for 1, dropping me to 19. At the end of his turn, I'll fetch, going to 18, for a Jetmir's Garden. I'll play Arid Mesa, and then cast Prismatic Ending on the DRC for 1. Ezra's going to cast Spell Pierce on the ending, which counters it, and triggers Dragon's Rage Channeler. He'll put a Ragavan into the graveyard, and then play Otawara as his land for turn. He'll cast Ledger Shredder, then Consider, which triggers both Dragon's Rage Channeler Channeler and the Ledger Shredder. In response to both of these triggers, I'll fetch, dropping to 17 for a Steam Vents, I'll shock that into play, dropping to 15, and I'll cast Lightning Bolt targeting the Shredder. This resolves, killing the Ledger Shredder, then he's going to pitch Dragon's Rage Channeler to the Shredder's trigger and then keep the card on top off of the DRC trigger, and then draw off of the initial Consider. He'll attack for 1 because he somehow doesn't have Delirium yet, dropping me to 14, and he'll pass the turn. I'll play Wooded Foothills, fetch down to 13, and shock down to 11 for a Sacred Foundry. I'll cast Fable of the Mirror Breaker, this triggers and makes a Goblin, and I'll pass the turn. Ezra Unholy Heats my Goblin Shaman and triggers his Dragon's Rage Channeler. He keeps the card on top, plays Scalding Tarn as land for turn, fetches down to 19 for an island, plays another DRC, attacks for 3 because he's now delirious, dropping me to 8, and passes. On my first main phase, we'll trigger Chapter 2 of Fable of the Mirror Breaker and pitch a land and an Archon to draw 2 more cards. Then I'll cast Iteration, I'll put a land in my hand, and I'll exile Leyline Binding. I'll play Scalding Tarn as my land for turn, fetch down to 7 for Xander's Lounge, and then I'll Binding the DRC and pass the turn. Ezra heads straight for combat and attacks me for 3, dropping me to 4, and with no more actions passes to me, so on my first main phase I'll flip Fable of the Mirror Breaker into Reflections of Kiki Jiki, I'll play Dwarven Mine as my land for turn, making a dwarf token, and I'll cast Binding on the DRC and pass the turn. Ezra's simply going to draw a card and pass back with nothing to do, so I'll play Bloodstained Mire, attack Ezra for 3, dropping him to 16, and pass. Ezra plays a Spire Bluff Canal tapped as land for turn and passes back, so I'll drop an Arid Mesa and attack for 3 more, dropping him to 13 and pass. Ezra then casts Expressive Iteration, but in response I'll cast Change the Equation to counter the iteration. Ezra's going to cast Counterspell, but I cast Veil of Summer in response and draw. This is ultimately going to counter the Expressive Iteration, so Ezra passes to me. I'm going to attack for 3, dropping him to 10, and then play Teferi. I'll minus the Teferi on my own Fable of the Mirror Breaker to draw a card and pass. Ezra's a bit flooded, so all he does is drop an island and pass the turn back to me, so I tick up my Teferi, attack Ezra for 1, dropping him to 9, recast that Fable, trigger it to make a Goblin, play Scalding Tarn as my land for turn, and pass back where Ezra simply draws and passes the turn. I'll trigger Chapter 2 of Fable of the Mirror Breaker and pitch Ren and 6 to draw 1 more card. I'll tick up the Teferi and head into combat, but before I can declare attacks, Ezra cracks the Engineered Explosives. So on main 2, I'll cast another Fable, trigger it to make another Goblin, and pass. Ezra casts Mishra's Bauble and then cracks it, targeting himself. He'll play Scalding Tarn as his land for turn, and then cast Unholy Heat, targeting my Goblin Shaman. I'm going to cast Change the Equation to counter the Unholy Heat, then Ezra fetches down to 8 to get an island in order to change what the top card of his library is. He'll pass to me, and in my upkeep, he'll draw off of his Bauble trigger. Then I'll trigger Chapter 3 of Fable of the Mirror Breaker and Chapter 2 of my other Fable of the Mirror Breaker. 1 flips, then I pitch a land to draw a card. I'll head to combat, attack with a Goblin for 2, bringing Ezra down to 6, and I'll make a treasure. Then I'll put Expressive Iteration on the stack, and Ezra has seen enough, he concedes the game, making us the winner of round 1.